He locked the door with me still standing outside. My own keys were useless, the lock had been changed. I stood on the porch in the fading evening light, one hand on the handle, the other clutching the grocery bag I'd carried up the steps only minutes earlier. It was absurdly ordinary: eggs, bread, a carton of milk, but suddenly the world wasn't ordinary anymore. I could hear the click of his footsteps retreating through the hallway, deliberate and unhurried. My husband had locked me out of our home, and in that sound I understood, this wasn't an accident. It was a choice. My name is Claire Morgan. I'm 32 years old. I've never been the kind of woman who dramatizes pain or makes a scene, though God knows I've been given opportunities to do both. I've always believed in steady hands, quiet strength, the sort of presence that doesn't need to shout to be felt. But standing there, listening to silence where a marriage used to be, I realized that my composure was about to be tested in ways I hadn't imagined. The betrayal hadn't started that night. It had been creeping in for months: missed calls, curt replies, the faint smell of cologne on a shirt that wasn't his. I noticed the details because that's how I move through life, observing, cataloging, connecting pieces others pretend not to see. I knew the truth long before the lock turned in the door. But knowing and facing are different things. That night, with groceries growing heavier in my arms, I could no longer avoid facing it. I set the bag down on the step and sat beside it. My legs trembled with a strange combination of fury and calm. The air was sharp with the scent of freshly cut grass from the neighbor's yard. A dog barked 2 houses down. Life went on around me, oblivious. My life, though, had fractured in the space of a single lock. I didn't knock. I didn't shout his name. I didn't want to give him that satisfaction. Instead, I took out my phone, stared at the black screen for a long time, and thought about all the things that had brought me here: the years of sacrifice, the loyalty I'd given without hesitation, the patience I had extended when it was no longer deserved. And suddenly, something cold and clear crystallized inside me. If he believed he could erase me with a lock and a bolt, he hadn't been paying attention to the woman he married. I wasn't going to beg him to open that door. I wasn't going to plead for answers. Instead, I was going to find a way in, not through the handle, not even through the house itself, but through the one thing he couldn't control: the law. That night I drove away with the groceries still on the porch. I don't remember much of the ride, only the passing blur of streetlights and the weight of a new decision pressing on me like gravity. By the time I reached the empty guest room at my sister's apartment, I'd stopped shaking. In the quiet dark, lying on a mattress that smelled faintly of laundry detergent, I whispered to myself the words that steadied me: this isn't the end. It's the beginning. And as I closed my eyes, one thought lingered, steady as a drumbeat: tomorrow, I would make sure he understood that locking me out was the last choice he would make without consequence. The real question was how far I'd have to go, and how much I'd have to lose, to open a different kind of door. The one no key could lock. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the porch light flickering against the groceries I had left behind. Morning came gray and thin, the kind of light that makes you feel suspended between yesterday and today. My sister's apartment was quiet, her children still asleep, and I found myself in the kitchen, staring at a chipped mug of coffee that had already gone cold. My hands didn't shake anymore. They felt steady, almost too steady, like my body had already accepted what my heart was still processing. It's strange how betrayal has a way of summoning ghosts. As I sat there, I thought of my grandmother. She had been the one constant in my life, the person who taught me that dignity isn't about what the world grants you, but what you refuse to surrender. I remembered her kitchen table, polished so often you could see your face in it, and the way she would press her fingers into my palm when she wanted me to listen. Never let them write your story for you, she used to say. If they try, take the pen back. Those words came back to me now, not as comfort but as instruction. I had always believed them, even admired them, but I had never needed them as much as I did in this moment. My husband had tried to write me out of my own life. He thought that by locking a door, he had locked away my voice. But my grandmother had lived long enough to know better. And so had I. I could almost hear her laugh, sharp, amused, unafraid, echoing in the back of my memory. She'd grown up with nothing and left the world with a name people respected. Not for wealth, but for integrity. When she died, I'd found her old Bible on the nightstand, its margins filled with her handwriting. Not prayers, not verses, but notes about land deeds, utility bills, and receipts. Evidence of a woman who knew survival meant documenting everything. She had built proof where others built excuses. I realized I had inherited more than her eyes and her stubborn jawline. I had inherited her way of seeing. Details mattered. Records mattered. The truth mattered, even when people pretended otherwise. Especially then. I thought of the contrast between her and the rest of my family. My mother, who always measured her worth through men. My uncle, who found excuses in every bottle. My sister, kind but timid, always one step away from folding under pressure. And me, caught between the grit of my grandmother and the resignation of the others. I had chosen steadiness, believing it would be enough. But steadiness doesn't stop betrayal. That morning, as the apartment stirred to life around me, children whispering, cartoons buzzing faintly from a TV down the hall, I felt the weight of that inheritance settle on me like armor. I wasn't going to wait for someone else to save me. I wasn't going to allow his decision to define me. The values I had clung to since childhood weren't abstract anymore. They were a map. I finished the cold coffee, poured the rest down the sink, and pulled my notebook from my bag. The one I always carried but rarely used. Its first page was still blank. My pen hovered for a moment, and then I wrote one line in small, deliberate letters. He locked me out. I will not stay outside. The words looked stark, almost fragile, on the paper. But the act of writing them down felt like breathing after being underwater. From there, I filled the page with fragments, names of lawyers I vaguely remembered from neighbors' divorces, the courthouse address, my grandmother's old advice about keeping copies of everything. It wasn't a plan yet, just a scatter of possibilities. But even scattered, it was more than nothing. Later, when my sister came into the kitchen, she studied me for a moment before speaking. She said, "You look calmer than I expected." I replied, "Calm is the only thing I can use right now." She didn't ask more. She didn't need to. She had seen me at my worst before, and this wasn't it. This was something else, something colder. By afternoon, I took a walk through the city. The sidewalks were busy, cars rushing by, but I walked as though the noise belonged to another world. I passed the courthouse steps without going in, but I looked at the building long enough to feel its weight, its permanence. Justice wasn't about emotion. It was about paper, signatures, seals. Things my husband couldn't erase with a deadbolt. The walk carried me further into memory. I thought of the last conversation I'd had with my grandmother, days before she passed. She had been sitting up in bed, sunlight falling across her lined face. I had leaned close, expecting comfort, but instead she had said, "Claire, when they come for what's yours, don't fight them with anger. Fight them with order. Anger burns out. Order lasts." At the time, I hadn't understood. Now I did. Order wasn't about control over others. It was about refusing to let chaos dictate the story of your life. My husband had chosen chaos. I would choose order. The realization didn't make the pain less sharp. It didn't erase the betrayal or the humiliation of being locked out of my own home. But it gave me something steadier than rage, direction. When I returned to my sister's apartment, I went straight to the notebook. This time, the notes came faster: bank accounts, shared property, the small things he never thought I paid attention to. The mortgage payment dates. The insurance policies. The way he had recently insisted on handling the utilities to make things simpler. Simpler for him, perhaps. But I had been watching. I had always been watching. The more I wrote, the clearer it became, he wasn't just trying to shut me out emotionally. He was preparing to erase me legally, financially, entirely. The lock on the door was just the surface. Beneath it, there was a deeper betrayal waiting to be uncovered. And as the last line filled the page, my pen pressing hard enough to dent the paper, I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't just preparing to survive him anymore. I was preparing to undo him. Pressure has a way of finding you, even when you think you're ready for it. It seeps in through silence, through small looks, through the weight of people waiting for you to break. The days after I began my notes felt like walking on a floor that shifted under my feet. At first, it was subtle, a voicemail I wasn't supposed to hear, my husband's voice laced with irritation as he told a mutual friend not to get involved. Then it grew sharper. The mailbox at my sister's apartment filled with envelopes addressed in his handwriting, demands wrapped in legal language, all of them delivered with a cruel efficiency. It was as if he wanted me to feel cornered before I had even stepped into a courtroom. The manipulations didn't surprise me. He had always been skilled at turning the narrative, painting himself as the reasonable one, me as unstable or difficult. What did surprise me was how quickly others echoed his tone. A cousin called late one night, her voice thin and insincere, urging me to just talk it out because you know how men get when they're pushed. The message was clear, they were already rewriting me into the role of the aggressor. That kind of gaslighting is its own form of violence. It doesn't bruise your skin, but it bruises your sense of reality. I caught myself second-guessing the details I had written down, wondering if I was overreacting, if I was inventing patterns where none existed. But every time I opened my notebook, I saw the clarity of those records staring back at me. The dates didn't lie. The bills didn't lie. And neither did the lock that had clicked shut in my face. Even so, the isolation was heavy. I moved quietly around my sister's apartment, careful not to disrupt her life, but I felt myself shrinking inside those borrowed walls. Nights were the hardest. The ceiling above me seemed too close, the air too thin. I would lie awake imagining him in the house, our house, stretched out in the bed we had chosen together, confident I had been erased. One evening, when the silence pressed too hard, I called the only person outside the family I still trusted, an old college friend named Lena. We hadn't spoken in months, but she answered on the second ring. Her voice was steady, grounding, as if she had been waiting for the call all along. I told her just enough, not everything, not yet, and she listened without interruption. When I paused, she finally said. She said, "You need someone who sees you clearly. If you let me, I'll be that person." Those words stayed with me long after we hung up. They didn't erase the pressure, but they gave me a single anchor point in a sea of uncertainty. The pressure grew bolder after that. I received a formal notice from his attorney, worded with the kind of precision that's meant to intimidate rather than inform. I carried it back upstairs like it weighed more than paper. My sister's eyes followed me, but she didn't ask. Maybe she was afraid of the answer, or maybe she already knew I was past the point of sharing the burden. I sat alone in the kitchen, the letter spread across the table, my notebook open beside it. My pen tapped against the margin, steady, rhythmic, until the sound itself became a kind of defiance. If he wanted to box me in, I would build my own walls of evidence brick by brick. Still, there were moments when the strength cracked. One night, after a call with his lawyer ended in a threat I won't repeat, I slipped into the bathroom, locked the door, and let myself fold over the sink. My reflection in the mirror looked foreign, pale, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, jaw clenched against something rawer than anger. For a moment I let it break through. My shoulders shook, breath hitching in shallow bursts. It wasn't weakness. It was release, a release I would never give him the satisfaction of seeing. When I straightened again, my face wet, I whispered the words my grandmother had left me, "Order lasts." Then I dried my face, walked back into the hall, and picked up my pen again. But the external pressure was only part of it. The deeper threat was internal, the creeping sense that maybe he could bend reality enough that others would believe him, that maybe even I would start to believe him. That thought chilled me more than any legal notice. It was in that state, weary, pressed, but stubborn, that Lena texted me a name. A lawyer she trusted, someone who, she said, doesn't flinch. I saved the number without hesitation. That night, as I turned off the lamp beside the bed, I felt something shift inside me. The pressure hadn't broken me. It had forced me into a corner where there was only one way out, forward. And yet, as I drifted toward sleep, another thought intruded, quieter but more dangerous. Pressure doesn't only harden resolve. It tests it. And mine was about to face its sharpest test yet. Strategy begins quietly, almost invisibly. It takes root in the silence after the storm, when fear has exhausted itself and only clarity remains. I saved Lena's lawyer's number in my phone and stared at it for a long while before pressing call. The ring was short, almost abrupt, and then I heard a voice, calm, clipped, professional. I didn't pour everything out at once. I gave only the details that mattered, the lock, the letters, the steady campaign of erasure. She didn't offer pity, only questions. Specific ones. About dates, documents, bank accounts. It felt less like telling my story and more like building a case, piece by piece. When I ended the call, I felt lighter, not because the problem had vanished but because someone had stepped into the labyrinth with me. Still, I understood, the work was mine to do. The lawyer could guide me, but it was my responsibility to collect the fragments, to weave them into something unbreakable. That night, I spread my notebook across the table. My sister hovered in the doorway but didn't enter. She knew by now this was not something she could carry with me. I sifted through envelopes, receipts, emails, even scraps of paper I had stuffed into my bag without thinking. Each one was a thread. The utility bills in his name, the mortgage statements, the credit card charges at restaurants I'd never set foot in. The pain was sharp at first. Each piece of paper was proof of both betrayal and intention. But as the hours passed, the sharpness dulled into something colder. By the time dawn light filtered through the blinds, I wasn't looking at a pile of papers anymore. I was looking at evidence. The lawyer had told me, documentation is the language the court respects. That sentence echoed as I copied everything into a binder I had bought that morning. A plain black binder, sturdy, unmarked. My grandmother would have smiled at that. She always said order begins with something you can hold in your hands. As I filled it, I thought about legacy. Not the kind people post about online, but the quieter one, the trail of decisions that defines how we are remembered when no one is looking. He was building a legacy of manipulation. I was building one of proof. I began keeping to a strict rhythm. Mornings I gathered. Afternoons I transcribed. Evenings I backed up digital copies onto a drive Lena had helped me set up. Each task became ritual, each detail a brick in a wall that grew higher between us. It wasn't revenge I felt, not yet. It was resolve. Still, the emotional cost was real. Some nights, exhaustion pressed so hard I had to step out onto the balcony just to breathe. The city lights below blurred into streaks, the air cold against my skin. I would stand there, binder clutched to my chest, and whisper into the wind, "You won't erase me." It wasn't a plea. It was a vow. Once, my sister found me there and asked softly. She said, "Does it ever feel like too much?" I replied, "Only when I forget why I'm doing it." The answer silenced her, but it steadied me. Because I knew why. Days turned into weeks. The pressure from his side didn't let up. More letters, more calls, more attempts to define me in words I refused to accept. But with every attempt, my binder grew thicker. And with every page I added, I felt the balance of power shift by a fraction. I became deliberate in how I carried myself. I didn't rise to his provocations. I didn't let fear rush me into mistakes. When the lawyer suggested patience, I listened. When she asked for more evidence, I delivered. My silence became its own kind of strength. It was during one of those quiet evenings that I realized the truth. I wasn't simply preparing to defend myself. I was preparing to confront him. Not in anger, not in chaos, but in a way he would least expect, with calm, with clarity, with order he couldn't twist into something else. The thought didn't scare me. It steadied me. Because confrontation wasn't just inevitable anymore. It was necessary. And as I slid the binder back onto the shelf that night, its weight firm and certain, I felt the shift inside me complete. I was no longer reacting to him. I was moving toward him on my own terms. The only question that remained was when, and how, that confrontation would arrive. Confrontations don't begin with raised voices. They begin in the silence before the first word is spoken, when everyone already knows the truth but pretends not to. The lawyer had arranged it, a meeting in her office, neutral ground. A table polished to a dull shine, a carafe of water no one touched, blinds half drawn against the afternoon sun. I sat on one side with my binder, my hands folded neatly in my lap. He sat opposite, arms stretched across the chair as if the posture alone could prove ownership. His lawyer was beside him, murmuring instructions he didn't need. He'd rehearsed his role long before we stepped into that room. I kept my eyes steady. Not on him, not on the lawyer, but on the binder between us. Its weight was real. The evidence inside wasn't opinion, wasn't emotion. It was fact. For weeks, I had built it page by page, and now it lay between us like a silent witness. The lawyer began with formalities, outlining the purpose of the meeting. But the words barely touched me. My focus narrowed to his face, the practiced ease, the smirk that flickered when he thought I wasn't watching. He expected me to break. He always had. Finally, he spoke. He said, "Claire, you're making this harder than it needs to be." I didn't look up immediately. I let the silence stretch, a rope pulled taut. Then, calmly, I opened the binder and slid a copy of the first document across the table, the mortgage statement with his signature, his dates, his handwriting. I replied, "Harder for who?" His smirk faltered, just enough. It wasn't victory. It was a shift, small, but visible. The exchange moved slowly after that. His lawyer pressed, questioned, suggested compromise. My lawyer countered with facts, dates, records. Each time they tried to blur the line, I turned a page. The binder spoke louder than I ever could. Still, there were moments when the tension cut through my composure. When he leaned forward, his voice dipped low. He said, "You won't win. I know how this ends." For a heartbeat, the old fear surfaced. The memory of the lock clicking shut, the isolation that followed. But then I saw his hands, restless, tapping against the table. A man rehearsed in control doesn't fidget. He was performing, but cracks were showing. I steadied my breath. I replied, "So do I." The meeting stretched into hours. Papers passed back and forth, words sharpened into weapons. My sister would have crumbled under this weight. My mother would have begged. But I sat still, spine straight, binder open, every page a shield. I wasn't fighting with anger. I was fighting with order. At one point, his lawyer leaned back, exhaling sharply. That sound was its own admission. They hadn't expected me to be this prepared. They had counted on silence, on hesitation. They hadn't counted on a woman who had inherited her grandmother's discipline. Near the end, when the room had grown heavy with fatigue, he tried once more. He said, "You're destroying everything we built." The words almost stung. Almost. But then I remembered the cologne, the lies, the cold night on the porch. I thought of the legacy I wanted, not the ruin he had chosen. I replied, "You destroyed it the moment you locked me out." The silence after that was different. Not tense. Final. When the meeting ended, I gathered the binder and stood. My lawyer gave me a nod, subtle but firm. His lawyer packed papers without speaking. He didn't meet my eyes as I walked past him toward the door. Outside, the air felt sharp, almost metallic. I breathed it in like medicine. My hands were still steady, but inside, something quaked, not fear, not anger, but the echo of release. For the first time, I felt the balance tilt. But confrontation isn't the end. It's the beginning of consequences. And as I walked down those courthouse steps, binder pressed to my side, I knew the fallout was only just beginning, and it would reach further than either of us had prepared for. fallout doesn't crash all at once. It creeps in, steady and undeniable, like water finding cracks you didn't know were there. The morning after the meeting, I woke to a silence that felt different from the ones before. It wasn't the silence of fear or waiting. It was the silence that comes when something has shifted, when a balance has tipped and you're standing in the aftermath. I knew I had gained ground, but I also knew ground is never held without consequence. The first consequence came swiftly. His lawyer filed motions designed to stall, to bury me in paperwork and deadlines. It was a tactic meant to exhaust me, to remind me that battles are not won in a single confrontation but in the long grind afterward. I felt the weight of it each evening as I sat with my binder, pages spreading wider, copies stacking higher. Yet every new motion was just another chance to reinforce my wall. Where they threw mud, I set stone. What struck me most in those weeks wasn't his aggression. It was his silence. No direct calls, no sudden appearances, not even the satisfaction of his anger thrown in my face. He had retreated into the machinery of lawyers and filings, as though he could vanish behind their words. But I could feel him there, pressing, calculating, waiting for me to falter. I didn't. Instead, I leaned harder into the rhythm I'd built. Each day, I balanced the strain of the legal process with small acts of reclamation. I transferred accounts into my name where I could. I made quiet visits to the bank. I pulled copies of policies and records that bore both our signatures, locking them into a fireproof box I kept hidden in my sister's closet. Control was built in fragments, and I gathered them with care. And yet, beneath the surface, there was cost. My body carried it, in the hollow under my eyes, the constant weight in my chest, the dreams where I still stood on that porch with the groceries in my hands. Even victory doesn't come without scars. There were whispers, too. Friends who pulled back. Acquaintances who believed his version of events. A few who asked if maybe I was being too cold, too unyielding. Their questions didn't wound me, but they deepened the isolation. I didn't correct them. I let their distance stand. Quiet resolve has a price, and sometimes it's paid in companionship. Through it all, Lena remained the steady voice in my corner. She checked in without pressing, offered help without pity. Once, over the phone, she said, "You sound stronger than I expected." I replied, "Strength is the only language he doesn't know how to twist." Her silence after that was the silence of understanding. The weeks folded into months. The motions continued, but the weight shifted further in my favor. Judges don't speak in absolutes, but I saw it in their eyes, in the way they lingered on the documents I'd assembled. The binder had become more than evidence. It was a testament to what he had done, and to what I refused to lose. But resolution doesn't only live in courtrooms. It lives in the quiet choices we make afterward. I began to reclaim space in other ways. I walked past our house one evening, not to confront, not to linger, but to see it from the outside with new eyes. The porch light was on. Curtains drawn. It no longer felt like my exile. It felt like a building. Nothing more. That realization steadied me more than any ruling could. I wasn't bound to those walls anymore. My sense of home had moved elsewhere, into the notebook, the binder, the box of documents, the quiet resolve that no lock could shut me out from myself. Yet closure is never clean. One night, as I organized papers late into the evening, I found a photo tucked inside a stack of receipts. It was of us, years earlier, standing on that same porch. I studied the image, his hand on my shoulder, my smile too practiced, too composed. It struck me how long I had been holding myself together even then, how early the fractures had begun. I didn't cry. I slid the photo into the back of the binder, not as memory but as record. Proof that even in the images meant to show unity, the truth had been written in small, invisible cracks. As the legal process bent closer toward resolution, my lawyer began to speak in terms of outcomes. Words like settlement, division, decree. They sounded final, but I knew better. Paper might close cases, but it doesn't close people. He would resist to the last, not because he believed he could win, but because refusal was the only power he had left. And I would meet that refusal the way I had met every other strike, with order, with proof, with silence sharper than any accusation. But as I stacked the last pages one evening and closed the binder with a firm click, I felt something else stir beneath the steadiness. Not fear. Not even relief. Something more uncertain, more dangerous. A question I wasn't ready to answer yet. Once this was over, what would I become without the fight? Endings don't announce themselves. They arrive quietly, almost without ceremony, and only later do you realize the door has already closed behind you. The decree came on a Tuesday. A plain envelope, delivered without fanfare, carrying the weight of months compressed into stamped pages. I sat at the kitchen table in my sister's apartment, binder beside me, and unfolded the paper slowly, as though haste might change the words. It didn't. The judgment was clear: division of property, financial restitution, the house awarded to me. His name stripped from accounts where once he had insisted on control. I read each line carefully, steady, detached. It wasn't triumph I felt. It was something colder, more final, the sharp snap of a lock giving way. The same lock that had barred me from my own home now turned against him, sanctioned not by anger but by order. Yet even in that moment of legal closure, I knew the deeper work wasn't about paper. It was about reclaiming myself from the shadow of what he had tried to reduce me to. The law had spoken, but it was my voice that had carried me here. My silence, my patience, my refusal to bend. I returned to the house 2 days later. The porch light was still the same, its glow softened by dust on the glass. The groceries I'd left behind that night were long gone, but the memory of them clung to me as I fit the new key into the door. It turned smoothly. No resistance. No defiance. Inside, the air felt stale, the rooms emptied of his presence but not yet of his absence. His things were gone. Drawers left bare, closets stripped. Only the shape of furniture indentations in the carpet remained, ghosts of a life dismantled. I walked through each room slowly, not searching for anything, just absorbing the quiet. In the bedroom, I paused longest. The bed was still there, stripped of sheets, the mattress bare. I touched the frame lightly, not in grief, but in recognition. This was where the fracture had been lived, night after night, before the door finally closed on me. Now it was mine again, not because I wanted it, but because it no longer held power over me. I opened the fireproof box when I returned upstairs. Inside, the documents I had gathered with such discipline seemed smaller now, their sharp edges dulled by time. They had done their work. They had protected me, spoken for me, restored what was mine. I placed the court's judgment on top, closed the lid, and for the first time, locked it not out of fear, but out of completion. Still, the quiet after victory is disorienting. For weeks, my life had been built around the fight, every hour, every note, every page. Now the silence stretched too wide. My hands reached for tasks that no longer existed, my mind circled patterns already resolved. I began to walk in the evenings, tracing streets that wound through neighborhoods I had once avoided for fear of being seen. No one stopped me now. Some glanced, some whispered, but I let their words slide past. Their stories about me had never been mine to carry. One evening, Lena met me at a cafe. She studied me across the table, her expression softer than it had been in months. She said, "So what now?" I stirred my coffee slowly before answering. I replied, "Now I live without looking over my shoulder." The truth of it felt fragile, as though speaking it might break it. But Lena only nodded, as if she'd known I'd arrive at that sentence eventually. Closure isn't clean. There were nights I still woke from dreams of the porch, of the locked door, of voices pressing me into silence. But each morning after, I rose, steadier. The house no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a shell I would eventually shed, a place to hold me until I was ready to choose somewhere new. One afternoon, sorting through the last of the boxes he had left behind, I found another photograph. Not of us, but of me, younger, standing with my grandmother on her porch. Her hand gripped mine tightly, her eyes fierce with the same clarity I had carried into every courtroom, every confrontation. I studied it for a long time before tucking it into the back of the binder. Not as evidence this time, but as reminder. Her words echoed, as if spoken just then, "Order lasts." And I finally understood she hadn't meant only in the eyes of the law. She had meant in the quiet dignity of how we carry ourselves after the storm. As the sun set that evening, painting the walls of the house in warm light, I sat on the empty floor and let myself breathe without planning, without strategy, without defense. For the first time in months, I wasn't waiting for the next blow. But as the last of the light faded, I felt something stir in the silence, not fear, not grief, but the edge of possibility. Life beyond the fight. A direction not yet chosen, but waiting. And I realized, the real confrontation hadn't been with him. It had been with myself, with the part of me that once believed endurance was enough. That part was gone now. What remained was something quieter, stronger, unshakable. And though the story with him had ended, mine, finally, was about to begin.